So one of the things that I've been doing in my public lectures is talking about the appropriate and responsible position of the left. So, you know, it seems to me that if you're pursuing goals that have value, which you have to do, because you have to do things in order to stay alive, you have to pursue goals of value. If you do that in a social space, which you're compelled to do, then you're going to produce hierarchies because people differ in competence. And you actually want to produce hierarchies that are based on competence because they're efficient tools for getting that particular job done. And so it's a reasonable position for people in the center and on the right to say, stand behind the hierarchies. But by the same token, hierarchies can tilt towards corruption and tyranny, and they tend to dispossess people because talents are distributed unequally.
Right.
So the left, the position of the left, that's the appropriate position, is to speak up for the dispossessed to keep the hierarchies flexible enough so that they don't turn into tyranny. And so then you have a dialogue between the right and the left that's necessary to maintain the hierarchy, but also to prune it and keep it healthy. And so one of the things that we could conceivably contribute to is to improve the health, as you're pointing out, conceptually and otherwise, of the dialogue on the left. It's like to give the devil his due, so to speak, and to say that, of course, there's a place for the left. The question is, when do they go too far, which is what I've been trying to push the moderates on.
Jordan, think about this. This is beyond communism. If you think about one phrase that sums up the theory of communism, what would you say? What the most famous phrase?
Well, probably from each according to their ability to each according to their need.
Now look at the first part of that phrase.
From each according to their ability.
Right. So the idea is that there are different abilities acknowledged in the very core of communism. This is beyond that.
Yeah. Right.
Right?
Oh yes.
Right.
Well,
They've already shelved that.
Well, I think the most pathological, the deepest unidimensional pathology that characterizes the radical left is actually an attack on competence itself. And so when I was at the Aspen Ideas Festival a couple of days ago, I made the case that our hierarchies in the West are determined at least in part by competence. Right? Now, the degree to which it's pure competence can be disputed, but intelligence and conscientiousness are the best predictors of long-term life success, even though they don't predict more than about 25% of the variance. But the buzz surrounding what I said was that Jordan Peterson is validating the current patriarchy by making the radical claim that it's predicated on competence. It's like, well, why would they twist that argument? Because it isn't what I said. I said that their competence is a partial contributor to our successful hierarchies. And I think the reason is that the very idea of differential competence is unacceptable to the most radical proponents of the left.
Let's look at two separate systems, because I think that what people do is they focus on one rather than the other, and I've had to learn how to do this. If we look at chess, which can be made blind, where you don't know who you're playing across the internet, and we look at musical editions for classical orchestras, where you can put people behind a screen. And I think this became popular in the 80s, 90s. A particular bassist who is also a psychologist may have been instrumental in getting this change. When you introduced the screen, women's participation in orchestras went up. Right? So it was a very positive social program because competency was apparently being suppressed by people's perception, by prejudice. It was a structural problem. Now, maybe it didn't go as far as people wanted. Maybe it didn't get to 50-50. I don't know what the stats are. I can look in on that. When you do it in chess, I don't believe it has a positive effect.
When they did it in the Australian Civil Service for blind CVs, it had the opposite effect. Women got underselected.
Right.
So you're saying, but you're saying is that this is situation specific.
The point is that the people who want to talk about chess, where of the top 100 players, last I checked, it was 99-1 male to female, which is so, like, even with structural bigotry, man, that's hard to explain.
Right.
In the other case of the classical orchestras, what was it, 20% increased participation of females? That's a giant amount, and they're both true. And so the problem is, when you push everything and you shove it into the low-dimensional space, you have this idea of, is this structural misrepresentation, or is it something else? Well, it's both, and it's situationally dependent. My wife had to make a point to me, which I was blind to, because in physics, almost nothing matters other than, like, horsepower and creativity. You don't care whether somebody's red, green, blue, male, female. It's just like almost nobody's got interesting ideas. It's so hard to make any progress whatsoever. You just want to take the far right tail of the distribution, and you don't want to be harassed about anything other than that.
Right.
Okay.
Math is like that, too.
Math is potentially even more.
Yeah.
My wife had to say to me, you know, Eric, not everything looks like theoretical physics or differential geometry. In fact, if you think about community policing, it can be extremely important to have diversity. Because why do you want one ethnic group policing another ethnic group, or all cops being male? You want diversity in order to have good relations, so that people see themselves reflected on the force, and if there is bigotry and prejudice, it manifests itself. It's harder to manifest if people are in fact diverse. So that was a bit of a wake-up call. The other thing came from the Harvard math department, where for a period of time it appeared that they would let in one woman a year into the PhD program, and then she would have a terrible year and she'd drop out. And then one year a woman deferred her admission, and so they added another woman, and you had 2 women in the first year, and the 2 of them reinforced each other's reality. Like, you know, I think I just said something and everybody ignored it, or I made a point and then somebody else went to the chalkboard and wrote it down as if it was his idea. And this group of 2 women stayed in the program, and that meant that the next year there was 1 woman let in. Okay, now there's a group of 3. And that was a situation in which there was an organic change in the apparent ability of women. Now, we need to be differentiating. We can't keep reacting to the madness of the left.
Multivariate analysis.
Right, right. We have to be the ones who are saying, look, let me steel man your point. You're making a terrible version of this argument. I think I can even do better, and you're welcome. Right? Because the other thing it's doing is it's deranging our conversation. This is why I had you talk to Ben and ask him point blank about whether he would use the pronouns, and his point was, I will in general be happy to use somebody's preferred program, except if we're discussing trans issues, in which case it is to cede the argument that there is no difference.
He doesn't want to publicly cede the argument, but privately
and that's the linguistic ground.
He's open about it, and this is what we have to stop reacting to the crazy making substrate.
So basically, you think that for the people that are keeping their foot on the pedal at the highest possible level, we sort of just have to let that go. But do you think it would be enough? So if, let's say tomorrow we finish this show today and you say, all right, I'm going to start being the champion for all the compassion that trans people, I mean, I know you're compassionate to all people, but I'm going to be publicly more compassionate to trans people and intersex people and address all of the issues that you just brought up. If there's another set of people that are never going to throw you a bone on that are never going to give you a little outreach on that, does it actually do anything, or you think it just allows us to get the refugees that'll kind of wake up around it?
Well, I think that we're being drained of our empathy. I mean, let me say I am being drained of my empathy. You know, there was a tweet that the Kentucky Planned Parenthood put out where it was one of these. Remember, it was some men have a uterus, and they repeated it like 11 times.
Yeah, that's the big thing now.
And if they'd written some trans men have a uterus, or if they'd written something, but we have to be compassionate that people who identify as, you know, whatever, I would be okay. But the idea of some men have there's actually something called persistent Mullerian duct syndrome, where people who are phenotypically male at birth appear to have a uterus because of the mysteries of development. I mean, again, the fact that males and females are 1 protein away from each other, and treating each other like we're separate tribes as opposed to, you know, Fisher-like complements is absolutely insane. And so I find myself making fun of these people, and I had some tweet about, you know, either we're talking about persistent Mullerian duct syndrome or you're just eating crayons hoping of pooping a rainbow. And, you know, I thought about this, and I thought, I'm so unsympathetic with you're trying to smuggle ideology into my world, into
using compassion,
into the laboratory. And you know, this is
it's reprehensible to smuggle in ideology under the guise of compassion.
But you know, this gets back to this issue that we have been having this expert conversation in the literature, where all sorts of things that cause people to clutch pearls on their fainting couches are absolutely parts of the literature in biology and psychology and anthropology, all of these places. And now everything is discussed everywhere. So when you hear, that there are group differences, it's shocking if you haven't been part of the professional civil conversation. And I think that that's a big problem, is that this is this esoteric versus exoteric speak, which is the sort of intellectual elite in the universities have this private way of talking amongst themselves in journals, and then this public way of talking. And this is absolutely essential in some areas, but it's being abused in others. So for example, the trade theorists know that what they talk about the importance of free trade based on Ricardian equivalence and comparative advantage is a bullshit argument. It's a very crude thing that's very hard to argue with mathematically. But if behind the scenes, they're having a completely different conversation. And they have the idea of, we're entitled to do this. And the answer, from my perspective, is you just replaced one concept, which was Kaldor-Hicks improvement with Pareto improvement. Pareto improvement makes everybody better off. Kaldor-Hicks leaves some people worse off and some people better off, and you'd have to tax the better off to compensate for the worse off. Well, we're having a countrywide freakout because the economists have developed two separate conversations. One for the public, where they push out things that are not necessarily good for the median individual or very bad for particular communities, and a separate conversation that they're having amongst themselves, and they're serving these interests. Well, we have to do something about this. We can no longer, this goes back to your Gutenberg point and the technology issue, we cannot have this level of division between the private and the public conversation. I know more about what's wrong with the immigration in the high-tech sector than the National Academy National Academy of Sciences wants to discuss. They are at the center, effectively, of a conspiracy in the 1980s and early 90s to change the laws of the United States in order to make it impossible for young scientists to bargain with PhDs in hand with their employers to get the six-figure salaries that the market was going to give them. Now, we can play a game where the National Academy is having a private conversation with me, where they've had me 4 or 5 times over there, and they're not going to have any reflection of this in the public. But I now have, 100,000 Twitter followers, and I know why people are angry about immigration. It has nothing to do with immigrants. It has to do with transfers. It has to do with the fact that our ruling classes have been figuring out how to transfer money from one group of Americans to another group of Americans, and if they could use puppies, they'd use puppies, because you can't object to puppies. Okay, well, the problem is that you now have a group of people who are able to have these conversations to say, let me show you the playbook. Let me show you what's really going on in these technical discussions. There are differences between groups that are measurable. IQ, I don't think any of us really want to be talking about race and IQ particularly. But when you try to say there is absolutely no evidence to show, well, that's not going to be true. And the scientists are going to have to say, look, I don't write reality. I report on what the literature says. Let me tell you what the literature says. And the literature says some things that we don't want it to say. But there's nothing new about that. Lots of science is very upsetting. Evolutionary theory is upsetting. Psychology is upsetting. And this upsetting literature, we haven't figured out what we are going to do culturally as it becomes available to everybody. And we have people who are sort of gleefully talking about things like race and IQ. And I want to tell them, cut it out. We don't really know everything, but we're getting more and more knowledge, and I'm worried about where it can go. And we have other groups of people who say, there's absolutely nothing to this race and IQ thing. I'm just thinking, well, this is like asbestos. You're now making an attempt to stir up the asbestos to try to get rid of it, and you're going to loosen all these fibers rather than doing this professionally and scientifically the right way. So I do think that there's an issue about the esoteric, the exoteric, and what it is that we are going to do as experts to handle the knowledge that we've been sort of exposed to and that the public hasn't. And it's coming out in the worst ways, and this is part of what's fueling the whole Make America Great Again situation, which is the public knows something is off with their expert communities. The expert communities are not being honest about what's in the literature.
So I would